Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for our fifth webinar in our series, The Hardware Marathon. We are looking at the phases and some of the obstacles encountered in developing a hardware product. If you haven't been able to join us for our previous series, we've covered several topics. We've covered how to utilize iterations to your advantage, the importance of using a physical representation to communicate your vision of the product. We've discussed several tools to protect your intellectual property. And in our last episode, we've discussed how to develop your best minimum viable product. You can find these on our YouTube channel if you haven't been able to join us. In our webinar today, we're going to look at the first steps involved in transforming the MVP to a manufacturing-ready product. For those who haven't attended the previous webinars, I'm Jenney Loper, the Director of Operations at Zebulon Solutions. I've been in manufacturing since the age machine shop, and after completing my degree in physics, I've held positions in every aspect of developing a physical product, from research to design to testing and scaling production to over 40,000 units per month. Most of my career has been working with a product after it has been designed, and I have over 2 decades of experience in manufacturing, quality, and supply chain management. In my current role, I have many conversations with people developing their first product, which was the basis for creating this webinar series. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Todd Hochwitz. He's the lead electrical engineer at Zebulon Solutions. Todd, would you introduce yourself to our audience today?
Sure. Thank you, Jenney. I have spent nearly 40 years developing products for commercial manufacturing and sale. I started out primarily with software, and after college, I transitioned to hardware development. The scales of designs that I've worked on have gone from integrated circuits to machinery that was used for manufacturing corrugated cardboard. Presently, my customer engagement focuses upon designing hardware that will scale for manufacturing and pass any regulatory testing.
Thanks, Todd. I'm glad to have you join me on this topic about getting a hardware product into production. So in our conversation today, we're going to discuss 3 topics. How do we at Zebulon Solutions use alpha phase and its role in hardware development? Several tips and considerations to design a successful alpha version of your product, utilizing testing and the results to refine of the product. And for our audience, we would love to have you engage with us during this event. It's hard to see on a computer who we're reaching. And so your comments and questions help us know that we are saying things that are interesting and important to you. If you do have a comment or a question, feel free to post them in the LinkedIn window. They will post in LinkedIn and they will also show up here in the webinar. We'll try to address questions throughout the session today, but we won't pause until the end for a separate Q&A. But don't necessarily wait till we get there if something comes up. So let's move into our first section.
At Zebulon Solutions, after we've tested out a proof of concept, our customer has completed the market feedback on the MVP, and we've developed a robust prototype. We call the next phase we move into alpha. There are other names in it within the industry, such as P0 or EVT, and there's probably others. Regardless of what it is called, it is the first iteration of the product that incorporates all of the must-have requirements. It must balance all future stakeholders' needs against those requirements. The product will look like the final version and have all the necessary functionality, but additional iterations are needed to drive out unexpected design weaknesses.
So the alpha phase marks a shift in how the design is approached. Up to this point, there has been a lot of discovery, investigation, research, and getting feedback to hone the design and the product's features. Both what the product did and what it needed to do were in flux. The requirements were being developed alongside the product, and both were iterating and informing each other. Pivots may have been necessary as discovery about the technology and the potential market were under. As alpha starts, the requirements are locked down, and ideally they shouldn't change. There should definitely be no more pivots. In reality, there may be some negotiation and evaluation of trade-offs between achieving the requirements and the cost, both in time and or money, to do so. A radical change in the requirements will likely trigger a new series of iterations, so having the requirements clearly understood will help guide these decisions. During this phase, we also start incorporating how the product is going to be fabricated. In some ways, production is still a long way off, but if we wait to start thinking about how the product will be produced when we are ready to manufacture, then enormous delays and redesign efforts could be required. At Zebulon Solutions, we've developed an 80-80-80 rule for hardware development. Up to this point, the project has been fun. Although it may have been a lot of hard. You may have faced some disappointments and failures. You may have had to pivot a time or three, but that's all the fun of the discovery about the product, the science, and the market. As we enter the alpha phase, we acknowledge that we're starting on 80% of the work. It may be difficult to envision that more than 80% of the work remains ahead because so much work has already happened. But this is indicative of developing a hardware product. It is a lot of effort. Later in our webinar today, we'll look at what makes up some of the work, but we also want to establish that development costs and testing during this phase are relatively small in comparison to the financial resources that are going to be needed to get production set up, and we'll cover that in future webinars.
During alpha, several tasks necessary for manufacturing start happening in parallel. Design, obviously, setting up the supply chain, and to begin thinking about how the product will be tested in production. We'll touch on each of those today. One of the recurring themes in hardware development is the occurrence and use of iterations, and alpha is no different. While it is easy to think about alpha being a one and done, that is rarely the case. Like previous versions, there is rarely one alpha revision. One question that frequently comes up is how many iterations or alpha versions are necessary. It really depends how well the MVP meets the requirements and how ready it is for manufacturing. The more development that is needed, the increased likelihood of multiple iterations. Also, as the design iterates, it may cause iterations in the supply chain or test development. While they each function as their own projects, they are interconnected, and changes in one area can affect the others. Now that we've looked at some of the fundamentals of the alpha design phase in our first section, let's look at how to successfully design a product for manufacturing. Up to this point, the design elements have been focused on communicating the vision, confirming the science, and understanding the market expectations. We will take those learnings along with requirements and incorporate the manufacturing processes to refine the product.
Well, let's first start with requirements. They are the guide and the compass for developing a product. While we've briefly mentioned them today and have assumed that they have been in process with developing the MVP, so that for those who haven't developed hardware products before, it is very possible that they don't exist. So let's talk about what goes into a product requirement and their structure. First of all, it needs to be a comprehensive list, a list of everything about the product. The most common thing that people start with is the function, MVP learnings, who the customer is, the price point, the feature set, the user interface, the use cases, and really what the market needs. You really shouldn't design a product that no one wants to buy. Another aspect to consider is environmental. For products in harsh conditions, this is frequently overlooked. But even if it's going to be used in kind of regular environments and nothing too crazy, it's still worth documenting where it's going to be used, indoor and outdoor, what their expected temperatures are going to be. Will it be directly or indirectly exposed to humidity or moisture? Will it be handled? And if it will be handled, it most certainly will be dropped. Or how it will be powered. Another area, if you're developing a product within the aerospace or medical medical industries, you will have a long list of regulations that are provided by those industries, such as the FDA or the FAA. Most products, if they have electronics, are subject to safety requirements that are defined through the UL standards or CSA. And if you're designing or incorporating any kind of a radio, you're going to be subject to Wi-Fi, like Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. You'll be subject to those, usually controlled by the FCC. Well, those are all US reality, as even if you're developing standards in other areas, they will still be, you'll still have regulations somewhere in there. So while I've not given you a comprehensive list of the comprehensive items, it's just really something to get started. Once you do have your comprehensive list, then it's good to be very detailed about it. Make it as detailed as possible, and because general statements are just too ambiguous to be helpful in guiding and validating the design. Using a spreadsheet is a good way to create categories and subcategories. And while I've only mentioned a few, frequently the feature set is broken down into, say, electrical or mechanical, and then broken down further, such as how it will be powered or what the sensor inputs would be on the electrical side, or mechanically what it needs to look like, what moving parts there are, or if there's a weight limit. Even for fairly simple projects, it isn't uncommon to have 50 lines of requirements to capture every aspect of the design. Partly sized projects, it isn't uncommon to have several hundred requirements to get everything captured. And if you've never created a requirements document before, we'll encourage you to start making these as complete as possible, but don't let that delay the design of the product. As you come across things that you identify as a requirement, be sure to go ahead and get them incorporated. Lastly, once you have your detailed list, it's good to go through each line and identify what the product absolutely must do. That would be how we would rank it, your number one priorities. That this would be informed by the MVP, really. What your MVP is going to identify as you can't go to the market without it. And then I would also rank them into things that you would want or the nice to haves. As you come across design issues or design things that are going to increase the cost of the time, you can negotiate those wants or those nice to haves. So once the requirements are in place, we can move forward with detailing out the product. One reason why I wanted to have Todd join me today was because he's got such great insight about how to design a product electrically for manufacturing. So let's get into some of the specifics in the design process.
Thank you, Jenny. Alpha is the first stage where the design has to consider balancing all future stakeholder needs, as we mentioned before, and these would include debugging or programming if you have programmable parts on your board or your product, testing, even before you go to manufacturing, how are you going to test it, which we'll talk about in a few slides. Manufacturing is a stakeholder, potentially repairs for your device are a stakeholder, the salespeople are going to be stakeholders, shipping, and the end customer. And all those have to be balanced against the requirements that Jenny just talked about. In terms of the initial approach, you're going to be looking at the electromechanical floor planning. Where are you going to place all the items that the user or all the stakeholders are going to interact with? Where are the displays and indicators? Where are the buttons or switches? Where are the battery compartments if it's battery operated? Are there any external connectors that are going to be connecting to your product? Fasteners, how are you going to keep this held together? And keepouts, are there going to be areas that you cannot use inside for electronics or other items? And then you also have to think how to best meet those electromechanical needs that we just discussed. Is it one single rigid PCB? Is it going to be multiple rigid PCBs in different places that have connectors and internal cabling? Is it going to be a mixture of rigid flex PCBs or just flex PCBs? Are there going to be some snap-ins or PEMs or other screw bosses in the enclosure? Eventually, you're going to have to think about how is this going to be tested during manufacturing? Will you make space in the PCB for test points and pads? Will you add connectors for a test harness? And how are you going to program the devices? Will it be programmed on the line, or are you going to have your supplier, your vendor, program them in to deliver them to you pre-programmed? You will also need to think about regulatory requirements. For example, a lot of recent boards and designs, they try to be as power efficient as possible. They use switching power supplies. Typically, you want to make sure that those are all grouped together as close as possible and that they're all on one side of the board to minimize the emissions and that you'll ensure passing regulatory. Radio devices should be kept as far away from those switching power supplies as possible. They will connect with each other. High-speed signals should be kept over a single ground plane. You should not try to split your ground planes anymore. That has gone by the wayside. And if you have to bring the high-speed signals off of the board, you probably want to consider adding chokes or filters so that they don't act like antennas and start radiating or pick up signals from radiators like PCB or Bluetooth or Wi-Fi devices. Also, you will have to start thinking about heat in your system. Your electronic devices are going to be generating heat. If you have a lot of current flow, you want to make sure that the PCB copper weight is as thick as possible so that the board doesn't heat up and you don't have to worry about cooling. However, if you want to use highly integrated circuits that have fine pitch, you can only make the copper so thick and still be able to solder those parts to it. So there's a trade-off that you have to consider between heating and size of the devices put on it. And then speaking of heating or cooling, you may have to consider, well, do we have to add elements? Do we have to add fans? Do we have to add TEC cooling modules? Or is passive heating and cooling good enough? And Environmental thoughts. If this device is going to be used in harsh environments, well, you have to conformally coat the device. And if so, do you have to think about putting all the items that you want to get access to after conformal coating together? Do you need to make your conformal coating mask complex or simple? And what sort of electrical anomalies do you have to survive? Do you have to survive ESD, somebody just touching and a spark being generated, or do you have to survive a lightning strike, direct or indirect? Do you have to support the possibility that your end customer is going to put the battery in backwards or put power reversed? Although those last two items, typically they should really be part of your requirements, as Jenney was talking about.
Todd, thanks for sharing all that. That's a lot of information to take into consideration, but I also know that's also not a comprehensive list of everything that goes into electrical design. I'm sure we could spend an entire webinar discussing how to approach the design to ensure it's manufacturable. But let me add to what Todd said by providing some mechanical aspects to consider as well. So appearance, this is the most obvious and the first impression of the product. Even for products that are going to be behind a closed door and carried by a customer, you want them to have a good first impression. Many times what the product needs to look like in the end is captured by the industrial design. The MVP may have gotten some market feedback, and you may be needing to incorporate that as well. However, the appearance will be limited. The other elements are going to add to the requirements. Usually after appearance, the next thing many people think about is functional. And so it needs to meet the user expectations from the MVP learnings. If it's just holding electronics, making sure that the electronics are held securely, I'll say again, and if it's dropped, or if it's going to be in harsh conditions so that it keeps those electronics dry. If it needs to have connectors, then there can be how you're going to hold the connectors and the cabling to provide some strain relief so that there isn't damage done to the electronics. And then moving components bring in a whole nother aspect of requirements to ensure that parts are wearing well together and not causing premature wear out. And I've mentioned this before, but it needs to withstand external forces, such as being dropped. Environmental requirements need to be taken into consideration as well. If it's going to be in an environment that needs to manage the differences in material expansion if different materials are used to make sure that there is not premature breakage or whatever as well. Taking into consideration hazardous or corrosive materials. This is frequently overlooked, but even cleaning agents can cause to wear down and degrade over time. If the product is going to be used outside or have direct sunlight on it, making sure that the material selected is UV stable. Lastly, and again, this is not a comprehensive list, but taking into consideration manufacturing, how it's going to be manufactured. It's really common during MVP and concept development to 3D print how the final product is anticipated to look without much regard for the details of how to get there. In alpha, the mechanical engineer will need to figure out the puzzle for what parts need to be fabricated separately and then assembled together. The manufacturing process is going to the design as well. For plastics, looking at how to avoid undercuts or slides in the tools can reduce the tool complexity, but it may also change the overall appearance or some minor areas. There are also some manufacturing limitations for how vertical a wall can be. In sheet metal, how sharp a corner is possible without welding it. Knowing ahead of time what limitations the manufacturing process is going to be used will influence what is possible in the design. Likewise, there may have to be specific accommodations based on the manufacturing process to avoid a product weakness or an undesired appearance. There's much more to be said about designing for manufacturing, which we may do in a future webinar. Beyond designing the product to be manufactured, there is the practicality of finding suppliers. Supply chain is one of the activities that will start during alpha and continue in parallel through to production. At Zebulon Solutions, we research and identify several suppliers for each custom manufacturing process, from electronics to plastic injection molding to sheet metal and more. This allows us to get multiple quotes and identify the best suppliers for our clients. Contacting testing suppliers during this resource to answer specific questions about manufacturing to ensure the design is able to be fabricated. We'll be posting a blog about this in upcoming weeks if you'd like to know more about this process.
In electronics design, there's always a temptation to use the latest, most highly integrated module RC in a new design. But that decision can usually cause future supply chain issues, and we saw that a lot during the COVID shutdown. The more integrated that a component is, the more likely that it is single sourced. Single sourcing can be a problem if the part is very, very popular and you are a small company. Volume sales are going to go to the Apple, Samsungs, Asus, Dells, etc. of the world. They're not going to go to small companies that are using only a few hundred of a part. They're going to go to those that are using thousands to 10,000s of a part. Or if the part is not very popular, companies will regularly make the part EOL if the sales just aren't there. Just because you really like it, that doesn't mean everybody else likes it. So there's always a risk in single source parts. While it's not as exciting, it is often safer to design in parts that have been around for a period of time and are widely available through numerous distributors. Octopart and fine chip should be used even at this point in your design process to make sure that the parts you're selecting are available, so you're not surprised once you get to the supply chain aspect. If possible, and space permits, design your PCB to be manufactured with parts with different footprints or from different manufacturers or different styles. It is far more efficient to be able to change a BOM and the pick and place programming than every few months having to relay out a board like we had to do with some of our customers a few years ago. The flip side of that argument, though, is that sometimes newer parts can be less expensive than the older parts on a feature-by-feature basis. In addition, there is a cost expense of having more line items on the BOM because they have to handle more parts and track more parts, and you have unused space in the PCB. But it also does add risk of someone using the incorrect pick and place and can potentially increase yield issues. More things go wrong with more parts on the board. However, these are all trade-offs that need to be just thought about at this point at the design phase in the alpha. So you can make the best decisions at the time.
Those are really good points about, especially for people who are just relatively small. I think going with parts that are really widely available and used across many product lines is a safer way to go. But there's also that risk of competing with the big companies. So thanks for bringing that out, Todd. To ensure you're ready for production, it is important to identify and order having a schedule to project when you expect to run your first production build will help guide which components need to be ordered ahead and when those orders should be placed. Of course, it is important to understand how many you're going to need to order, and that can be informed by what you learned during your MVP. One thing to note, just because there are quantities available for small prototype builds does not necessarily mean that they are available for the larger builds that you will need in pilot or production. So plan ahead. Well, we've provided some basic guidelines about how to test a product. We've provided basic guidelines for design. Let's now talk about how to test the product in a productive way. Throughout the development process, testing has been important and it continues to be paramount once you work towards manufacturing. Once the product is designed, it needs to be tested to determine how well it meets the requirements and any areas that need to be redesigned before production and market release. Up to this point, testing may have been somewhat informal, but in alpha, formal testing is important, especially if regulatory testing is necessary for the product. This test is commonly referred to as EVT, or engineering validation testing. One of the reasons we lean so heavily on requirements is because it ought to be tested. At Zebulon Solutions, we start with the requirements document and go line by line to determine how we can test the product for each item. We build out a test plan from this information and identify what we are able to do ourselves versus using a testing laboratory. To manage financial resources, we try and mock up as many tests as possible to pre-test the product and verify it meets the requirements. It seems obvious, but it is important to know what a passing and failing result looks like, and knowing the requirements for the product will establish the criteria. It is likely that there will be failures in the first round of testing. This shouldn't be viewed as a bad thing, but an opportunity to make the product more robust. It may take some detailed analysis to identify the actual cause of the failure, so it can be addressed in the design. It is extremely important to understand and take action as to why each part fails in any given test. There are clues about what can go wrong in manufacturing, and a good to address yield issues to prevent them from being designed during the product development.
The time and the money for properly testing hardware can easily dwarf that allocated for design of the product. While the requirements do help define the sort of testing that needs to be done and the pass-fail criteria, quite oftentimes a simple requirement can require a very complicated or multiple testing. For example, if you're going to be measuring some sort of physical system or physical quantity, there's usually multiple parts in your system involved with that. There's a physical to electrical step and then an electrical to electrical step that you have to be able to test and quantify both of those aspects just to meet one requirement. You will often likely need dedicated or sometimes expensive equipment to validate the design. For an example, environmental chambers or some electrical or physical world stimuli and reference meters. You will want to make sure that any stimulus equipment is rated for operation well outside of what you're trying to measure. We call that guard banding. You want to make sure that if, for example, if you take your product down to minus 40 C, well, whatever you're testing it with had better be able to control that well below minus 40 C to ensure that your product sees at least that. You don't want to get it out in the field and find out from a customer, well, right at minus 40 C, it fails. The general rule of thumb for the meters and reference systems that are used to compare your performance against your requirements is that whatever you use to measure it is 10 times better than what you're trying to target. That can get expensive fast. If you need to go to an external lab or rent equipment, then you also need to be careful about the scheduling of fabrication and builds and also any firmware or software. You have to make sure it is ready at that point in time. So scheduling is critical when you're coming up with testing. In addition to the regulatory testing and other testing that Jenney mentioned earlier, some aspects of products require compliance testing. For example, USB, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth. Not only do you often have to go through the emissions testing, but each of those regulatory or each of those bodies, those governing bodies, they have a set of requirements for how a device has to function when used in that environment with USB, Wi-Fi, or Bluetooth. It's called compliance testing. They want to make sure that if you take your Wi-Fi device, put it in a Wi-Fi network, it's going to play well with other devices. That requires testing at some dedicated labs, paying money for that. In addition, there may be some licenses involved to use that technology or to indicate in your marketing brochures that you're using that technology. So be aware that there is additional money involved with some of these technologies.
Todd, thanks for bringing that out. That I think that we do harp on the testing quite a bit, but there is the licensing behind that also needs to be considered. In our first webinar, we discussed iterations pretty thoroughly, but we mention it here again because they continue to be critical to your product's success. In our previous section, we discussed some ways to approach the design, and once you are confident the product meets the requirements, it is ready to get fabricated. Even the process of fabrication can reveal issues that will need to be addressed before you can go for manufacturing. After receiving the parts and assembling them together, making notes of what doesn't quite fit right should be incorporated into the next version as the cycle repeats itself. Methodically testing and analyzing the data will identify how the design needs to change. There will be iterations, but with a solid requirements document, it can guide what failures need to be corrected and what might be acceptable to release to the market. Future products can both expand the feature set and address known issues. So this brings us to the end of the information we wanted to share with you today. And I know that it can seem like we've covered a lot here, and time has really flown by. I didn't realize we were so close. But we're going to stop for a few questions because I'm hoping that there's some questions that have come up. While we are waiting for questions to come in, I thought I would share a few of the insights as a summary that we've talked through. First of all, the alpha incorporates all the must-have requirements into a single product. The design is influenced by the manufacturing process and through a formal plan to validate the design against the requirements. Let's see if that was long enough for people to put some questions in. Oh, there we go. Let's see. I've heard repeatedly that once my MVP is done, I should take it to a manufacturer to help design it. You seem to be describing a different process. What are your thoughts on having a manufacturer design your product for their process? Todd, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take a stab at it?
Well, so one of the items that you do run the risk of is you're locked into a manufacturing process that it may be unique to that supplier or that manufacturer. You may not be able to take it very readily to another place should you need to. Now, you may say, well, why would I ever need to? Well, we have had situations where customers outgrew their supplier. Luckily, that's what we really, really want. And the supplier did not want to scale with them. So they still had the technology. The customer wanted to go to another manufacturer. They did not own the design. They had to start from scratch again. So those are the biggest risks that I could see with going directly to a manufacturer as opposed to a design firm.
Yeah, I've heard that repeatedly. Actually, I had a client several years ago that had engaged with a plastic injection molder, and they had done all the plastics design work. They actually even owned all the tools. And unfortunately, when things went south with that supplier, they not only didn't have access to the tools to continue making product that they could sell to their customers, but they didn't even have the CAD files. They had to go all the way back to their industry, start over again. What I thought was interesting is that I thought that they had learned their lesson on the plastic side of things, and when they engaged with their next set of manufacturers, they did the exact same thing on firmware. And so I think that it's something that's really common. Well, it seems like an easy approach to have the manufacturers work for you. There is certainly risk that you may not actually own that intellectual property. And I mean, the suppliers that you engage with, that you are first starting a product, it is so common to outgrow them because hopefully your business is going to expand. And what served you well with a small manufacturer too big, and they won't be able to serve you as well as your sales grow. So, good points. Any other questions? Let's see. Hey, Tony, good to see you. You mentioned that you should not split ground planes. Can you expand on that? Todd, that is all you.
Yep, that is an excellent question. So to clarify, what I was talking about not splitting ground planes is strictly for high-speed signals or those that may go through digital interfaces. There are times where you do have to split ground planes. For example, if you need galvanic isolation or high voltage isolation between different parts of the circuits, you have no choice there. But the conventional wisdom used to be split your ground planes for different parts of your system, digital and analog. Anymore, because of our highly integrated systems, you don't want to do that because that leads to a change in the impedance of the return current or the return path. And that will lead to worse signals, greater emissions, impedance mismatches. You may not pass USB or Wi-Fi if you run those signals past openings in your ground plane. So the convention these days is use a single ground plane, run your signals near that to get optimal impedance matching and a good return path, because whatever's going out is coming back. So you want that to go back in one nice loop, and only split ground planes when you have to for galvanic or high voltage isolation. That's the reason why split ground planes aren't as desirable anymore as for all of these signals that are tightly packed together and may emit more once you split the ground plane.
Ever-evolving technology changing the way you have to design, huh?
Yes. When I started out in the 90s, it was almost always splitting ground planes. Nowadays, rarely.
Gotcha. All right. I think we'll take one final question. This one is, what are your thoughts on 3D printing mechanical parts in alpha? So since I'm kind of the mechanical person here, I'll answer this, and then if it's not insufficient, then reach out to me and we'll get a better answer from the mechanical engineer. But I would say 3D printing parts in alpha, absolutely. The one thing that I would say that is different between 3D printing parts in alpha versus 3D printing parts is that you actually design the parts that you would want to have eventually molded, and then print out the parts as you expect them to be molded. And that will give you some early indications about how well your design will work, if there's any interferences that need to be taken into consideration. And it will also show like what kind of gaps and things like that, and if the gaps are in a desirable place for parts that have to be fit together. So absolutely 3D print your alpha parts, but I would 3D print them as they're going to be molded, not the alpha ones, not just the whole design. All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here. Thank you, everyone, for your participation and your thoughtful questions. As we wrap up, Todd, is there any insight that you'd like people to walk away with?
I think the only other subtle item I'd like to mention is that Alpha is often the first time that you get a better idea how solid your IP is if you've generated any IP going into this manufacturing process or this development process. Oftentimes, patents are written based upon just purely an idea or a proof of concept that was done early in the process. And oftentimes, things are overlooked. And as you go down the path of making your alpha product and your beta product, you may find out that there's real world issues, perhaps manufacturing, that could easily invalidate some of your patent claims. So the alpha phase is often where the deficiency becomes apparent first.
I would say on the flip side of that is it also brings up a deficiency, but it would also potentially expand your patent if you found other ways that you could take on more patent that would actually make your patent and your IP protection even greater. So thanks for bringing that out. That's something we hadn't covered at all. And thank you so much for joining me today. I've appreciated that we've been able to talk through developing an alpha product in our Hardware Marathon series. We only have 3 episodes left. We'll look at the final steps before manufacturing in the beta phase. Our starting point will be a completed alpha revision, and I hope you'll all be able to join us for that. In parallel with our webinar series, I mentioned this before, we are releasing blogs on each of the 7 phases. And it looks like there's actually blogs that are getting thrown in as well. So stay tuned for that. Today's topic is already posted on our blog page on our website, ZebulonSolutions.com. As I mentioned earlier, this video will be on our YouTube channel. And if you have any additional questions for either Todd or myself, please reach out and fill out questions on our Contact Us page on the website. Or you can send us an email at info@zebulonsolutions.com and just mention the webinar along with your question. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again next time.